Everyone views Canada as a geopolitical sanctuary, the polite neighbor, the land of stability and democratic integrity, the American dream, only cleaner, safer, and gentler. But this image is a snare. While the world gazed at the smile, no one saw the shackles. Canada's social contract wasn't merely breached, it was incinerated. They silently constructed a new matrix, a system where you labor relentlessly but own nothing, where debt is inherited across generations, and where your freedom is reduced to a subscription service they can revoke at will. Forget capitalism, dismiss democracy, welcome to the world's first modern feudal state. And this is the forensic deep dive into how they bolted the cage shut. Ignoring this inconvenient truth is a luxury that has expired. This is Macro Threshold, and we are initiating the forensic audit into the maple-forged shackles, here on the era of collapse. The first, most lethal symptom of this new structural collapse is the obliteration of the ownership class. What Canada once proudly called the middle class is now a historical curiosity, a phantom demographic that operates strictly on the treadmill of perpetual debt service. The promise of vertical mobility, the foundational principle that if you work diligently, you will earn the right to own equity, assets, and time, has been retracted. It is not just difficult to get ahead. It is mathematically impossible to catch up once you fall behind. We are now past the tipping point where hard work correlates with financial freedom. For vast swaths of the population, particularly in major urban centers, we must introduce a terrifying new metric: zero disposable net income. After mandatory statutory deductions, taxes, insurance, pension contributions, and after servicing the crushing housing liabilities, whether in the form of usurious rents or astronomical mortgage payments that devour 50% or more of gross income, the remaining number is often zero, sometimes negative. This is not poverty in the traditional sense. This is compulsory financial stasis. You're earning enough to operate the machine, but you're not permitted to exit the track. Every moment of labor merely services the debt required for the necessity of shelter, transforming the individual from a productive capitalist agent into a perpetual debt serf, tethered permanently to the economic demands of the state and the financial institutions that own the underlying assets. This is the mechanism by which the control matrix is established. When ownership is unattainable, freedom becomes illusory. To understand the depth of this structural regression, we must step outside the modern paradigm and acknowledge the historical precedents of servitude disguised as societal progress. The blueprint for modern Canadian insolvency is chillingly familiar, mirroring three distinct historical collapses that redefined the relationship between the governing class and the productive class. The first, and perhaps most obvious analog, is medieval feudalism. In the feudal system, the serf was not technically enslaved, they were tied to the land. They were afforded a piece of ground to work, but the land itself was held by the lord. The serf's labor was their rent, paid in kind or in time, and vertical mobility was a concept so alien it couldn't be articulated. Fast forward to modern Canada, and we see an exponential concentration of land ownership, not in the hands of a single noble, but in the hands of institutional investment funds, global corporate entities, and the few hyper-wealthy individuals who are protected from the inflationary forces that crush the working class. The modern Canadian tenant, the renter class, operates functionally as the serf. Their entire lifetime of work is spent servicing the rent, the modern tithe, while the equity generated by their tenancy accumulates in the ledgers of institutional landholders. They labor on the land, they maintain the property, and they contribute to its escalating value, yet they will never own it. The only difference is that the new lord doesn't demand allegiance in person. He demands it electronically every first of the month, enforced by digital systems and credit scores. The second foundational analog that screams warning is Japan's lost decade, or more accurately, the 3 decades of economic stagnation that followed the hyperinflation of their asset bubble in the late 1980s. When asset prices, particularly real estate, become completely decoupled from underlying economic productivity, the entire structure becomes brittle. Japan demonstrated what happens when the collective debt, built upon inflated collateral, becomes the foundational anchor of the economy, trapping generations in perpetual unserviceable obligations. They entered a state of balance sheet recession, where the priority of every economic actor, from the individual household to the largest corporation, was deleveraging and asset management, not productive investment or organic growth. In Canada, we see this danger amplified. An economy fundamentally reliant on housing price appreciation to sustain a positive outlook, where the debt required to purchase an entry-level home is so vast, it guarantees long-term servitude. This structure doesn't permit failure. The entire state apparatus, from central banks to provincial policies, is engineered to prevent any meaningful correction in asset values, precisely because such a correction would immediately expose the insolvency of the average household and collapse the banking system. It is a suicide pact disguised as a stable market, where the stability is an illusion maintained by constantly leveraging future production against today's hyperinflated assets. The third parallel is drawn from the final years of the Roman Republic and its slide into imperial dependency, the fatal reliance on state patronage, often summarized by the phrase bread and circuses. The Republic ed from a society of self-reliant citizens, farmers and soldiers who had true agency, to a population increasingly dependent on the state for its basic sustenance and social stability. The unsustainable proliferation of public expenditure and social services, while seemingly humanitarian in intent, fundamentally destroyed the incentive structure for economic independence. When the state provides an expansive safety net, often paid for by future generations through debt, it inadvertently lowers the threshold for acceptable poverty, normalizing the lack of ownership and personal responsibility. It replaces the difficult pursuit of ownership with the simple acceptance of subsidy. This dependency creates a populace highly amenable to control, as the state's ability to revoke those subsidies becomes the ultimate mechanism of behavioral modification. You cease to be a citizen with inherent rights and become a client whose privileges are conditional upon cooperation. This is the crucial intersection where housing crisis meets social policy. The state leverages the housing insecurity it helped create to enforce behavioral compliance, completing the from citizen to subject. The serf is compliant because their tenancy depends on it. The modern citizen is compliant because their subsidy depends on it. These historical warnings are not mere academic exercises. They are the ghost echoes of what is currently manifesting in hard, quantifiable data. The current diagnosis of the Canadian financial system shows an economy not merely struggling, but one structurally optimized for serfdom. We need only look at three key quantitative metrics to confirm that the financial abyss is opening. First, consider the household debt burden. Canada consistently ranks at the pinnacle of the G7 nations for its household debt to GDP ratio. This ratio, often hovering above 100%, represents a massive systemic vulnerability. While that level of debt is often rationalized away by apologists citing robust banking systems or strong national balance sheets, the second metric exposes the agonizing pressure being placed directly on the average citizen: housing affordability. In Canada's major metropolitan areas, housing liabilities, whether mortgage payments or escalating rent, now routinely consume over 50% of median household income. Remember the core function of the serf in a feudal state. The majority of their labor, and thus their income, was claimed by the lord for the use of the land, leaving only bare subsistence for the laborer. When half of a person's earnings are immediately liquidated just to retain a roof over their head, we have reached the functional definition of zero disposable net income. You are not accumulating wealth, you are transferring it. You are not investing, you are perpetually leasing the basic necessities of life from the new landed gentry. The economic structure guarantees that upward mobility is not merely difficult, but statistically impossible for the majority, unless they are already asset-rich. This grim reality is structurally confirmed by our third metric, the dangerous decoupling of productivity and debt growth. For a healthy economy, debt should ideally be utilized for productive investment, meaning that the borrowing facilitates growth that outpaces the debt accumulation itself. However, in Canada, debt growth consistently and aggressively outpaces productivity growth. Now, this is the smoking gun proving the system is funding consumption and speculative asset inflation, primarily housing, through borrowing rather than genuine wealth generation. The nation is trapped in a spiral where the perceived wealth is entirely illusory, resting upon the continuous inflation of non-productive assets that anchor the populace deeper into unserviceable liabilities. The Canadian economy is not a picture of vibrant, dynamic capitalism. It is a sophisticated, debt-fueled extraction machine, structurally designed to maximize the velocity of cash flow from the indebted, working class, straight into the institutional asset class. This leads us to the final, most chilling aspect of the modern Canadian predicament: the formal institutionalization of the perpetual tenant model, which we call the disaster chronology of the subscription economy. If the objective is to create a compliant, non-owning class, the mechanisms must be bolted into the policy framework, and that process began through three interconnected stages. The first stage cemented debt as the fetter. By allowing housing assets to hyperinflate so drastically that they became unattainable through labor income alone, the state ensured massive reliance on subsidies, tax credits, and government programs designed to bridge the affordability gap. The moment you require state intervention to secure basic shelter, you exchange economic sovereignty for conditional financial support. This is the crucial policy lever. The state does not need to own the land itself. It only needs to control the necessary lifeboats in a self-inflicted economic storm. Dependence on these subsidies and benefits, for housing, for carbon taxation rebates, or even for healthcare access, provides the systemic control required for behavioral enforcement. The serf is compliant because their tenancy depends on it. The modern Canadian is compliant because their subsidy depends on it. The debt serves as the chain, and the benefit package is the collar. The second stage was the Great Consolidation. As the housing market reached absurd valuations, the primary buyers ceased to be individual families and transformed into massive institutional funds, corporate landlords, and real estate investment trusts, or REITs. These entities do not view housing as shelter. They view it as a perfectly reliable, non-depreciating, recurring revenue stream. By consolidating vast swaths of residential property, they are actively transforming Canadian housing stock from an owned asset class into a perpetual rental asset class. This process reduces competition, drives rents higher, and ensures that the wealth generated by housing is extracted eternally, rather than being reinvested or passed down through generational equity. The concentration of land ownership that defined medieval feudalism has returned, only this time the lord is a geographically dispersed, legally complex, and infinitely more powerful financial institution whose sole ethical mandate is quarterly profit maximization. The serf pays rent to the physical lord, the tenant pays rent to the algorithmically managed portfolio. The outcome is identical: the erosion of individual autonomy through the necessity of tenancy. This system finds its final, terrifying expression in the third stage: digital control and the revocable license. When the state has engineered an economic environment where the citizen must rely on subsidies, the fetter, and cannot acquire sovereign assets, the consolidation, the only remaining step is to ensure that their entire economic participation is conditional and easily terminated. The ultimate threat to sovereignty is the potential centralization of digital identity and digital currency, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. While often marketed under the guise of efficiency and anti-money laundering, the operational reality of a CBDC is the ability to program money and, crucially, to revoke participation instantly. If your spending, your subsidies, and your very economic existence are tied to a centralized digital ledger, compliance becomes mandatory. Should you violate new behavioral terms, whether defined by political dissent, vaccination status, or even socially inappropriate speech, the system can instantly render you economically inert. Your freedom is reduced to a subscription service that can be revoked at the click of a remote mouse. The right to fail, the core pillar of economic sovereignty and risk-taking that fuels progress, is eliminated. You must succeed, not by achieving wealth, but by maintaining sufficient social and political compliance to retain access to your conditional livelihood. This forensic audit confirms the thesis. The quiet, polite neighbor to the south has completed its transformation. Canada is not merely suffering from an affordability crisis. It is functioning as the world's first modern feudal state. It is a system designed to guarantee subsistence and social safety net coverage, but only in exchange for fundamental economic freedom and generational opportunity. It has successfully decoupled labor from ownership, leveraging crushing debt and hyperinflated assets to maintain an iron grip that is softer and far more insidious than any iron fist. The cost of this system is not measured in dollars, but in human sovereignty. When the ability to dissent, to withdraw from the system, or simply to take risks that lead to failure without losing your access to basic economic life is eliminated, what future remains for your children? Do you believe you still own your economic destiny, or are you merely a well-maintained, highly compliant tenant in an algorithmically managed portfolio? The analysis is clear, and the data is irrefutable. Now, the defense must begin. This is Macro Threshold, and our purpose is not merely to describe the collapse, but to equip you with the strategic foresight necessary to defend your financial frontier against these structural shifts. Understanding this from democracy to conditional sovereignty is the first essential step in protecting yourself and your family. If this analysis of the modern feudal state resonates with the uncomfortable truths you witness every day, then we urge you to engage.